The easiest person to laugh at is often the one who has nothing left to prove. The laughter echoed softly across the polished marble hallway outside Family Court 12, bouncing off glass walls and polished steel railings as if success itself had decided to mock humility one last time. Claire Whitmore, one of New York's youngest and most celebrated technology CEOs, adjusted the sleeve of her tailored ivory suit before letting out another amused smile. Her attorneys gathered around her, exchanging quiet congratulations while reporters waited beyond the courthouse doors, eager to capture the end of another high-profile marriage. Across the room, Marcus Reed quietly lowered his pen after signing the final divorce papers. There was no anger in his expression. No desprit pli, no bitterness. His dark eyes rested for only a moment on the document before he folded his hands together with the calm patience of a man who had already accepted what everyone else believed was his greatest defeat. Claire tilted her head and looked at him with unmistakable pity. "I hope you find the simple life you always wanted," she said with a smile that barely concealed her satisfaction. A few people nearby chuckled politely. One junior associate whispered that Marcus had just walked away from millions. Another quietly wondered how any man could lose both his marriage and nearly every shared asset without putting up a fight. Marcus answered neither of them. Instead, he stood, buttoned the plain navy blazer he had worn for years, and reached for the small pink backpack resting beside his chair. 8-year-old Ava looked up at her father with trusting brown eyes, slipped her tiny hand into his, and smiled as though none of the noise around them mattered. "Are we still getting pancakes, Dad?" she asked softly. Marcus smiled back. "Absolutely. Promise is a promise." For a brief second, even the courtroom seemed quieter. Claire watched the exchange with folded arms, convinced she had finally left behind the ordinary man who had never fit inside her extraordinary world. She believed ambition had separated them. She believed wealth had measured their worth. She believed the signature drying on. Those papers marked the final chapter of Marcus Reed's story. What she did not know was that less than an hour from that courthouse, a Gulfstream G700 sat waiting on a private runway with its engines prepared for departure, a veteran flight crew already standing by, and a polished brass nameplate beside the cabin door engraved with 2 simple words that would soon silence every assumption she had ever made. Marcus Reed. The crisp autumn air greeted Marcus and Ava as they stepped out of the courthouse, leaving behind polished floors, expensive suits, and the quiet judgment of strangers who believed they had witnessed the end of a man's story. Ava squeezed his hand a little tighter. "Dad, are you sad?" she asked, looking up with the honest concern only a child could carry. Marcus glanced down and smiled gently. "Some days end differently than we hope, sweetheart. But that does not mean tomorrow cannot begin beautifully." She nodded as though that answer made perfect sense, because when her father spoke, he never promised easy days. He only promised they would face them together. They crossed the sidewalk toward a small neighborhood diner several blocks away, the same place Marcus had taken her every other Saturday since she was 4 years old. The waitress greeted them by name before leading them to a corner booth near the window. She poured 2 glasses of orange juice without asking because she already knew Ava's favorite breakfast. Marcus thanked her with the same quiet respect he showed every person he met. The morning sunlight spilled through the glass, painting warm reflections across the worn wooden table, while the scent of fresh coffee and maple syrup filled the room. It was the kind of place executives usually overlooked, but Marcus had always preferred places where people remembered names instead of titles. As Ava colored on the back of the children's menu, Marcus found himself remembering another breakfast nearly 11 years earlier. Claire had not been a famous chief executive officer then. She had been an ambitious young software engineer carrying more dreams than confidence. They had met inside a modest coffee shop in Brooklyn after she accidentally spilled an entire cup of coffee across a stack of engineering sketches Marcus had been reviewing. She had apologized 3 times before he laughed and assured her that paper could always be replaced. That unexpected kindness became a conversation. The conversation became dinner. Dinner slowly became love. In those early years, they shared a tiny apartment with squeaky hardwood floors, second-hand furniture, and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the traffic outside. Marcus worked long hours as a product consultant while quietly investing in companies almost no one had ever heard of. Claire poured every ounce of energy into building her career, and Marcus celebrated every promotion as though it belonged to both of them. When Ava was born, Marcus made a decision few people understood. He declined a demanding executive position that required constant international travel. Instead, he chose flexible consulting work that allowed him to be present for school mornings, bedtime stories, piano lessons, scraped knees, and every science fair. Claire respected the decision at first. Then promotions came faster. Awards followed. Magazine covers arrived. Boardrooms replaced family dinners. Somewhere between quarterly earnings reports and television interviews, she stopped seeing sacrifice and started seeing lack of ambition. Friends congratulated her for becoming one of America's rising business stars, while quietly asking why her husband never seemed interested in chasing more money. Marcus never defended himself. He simply smiled, held Ava's hand a little tighter each evening, and believed that one day actions would speak more clearly than explanations ever could. The pancakes arrived with warm butter slowly melting across the golden stacks, but Marcus barely noticed the sweet aroma drifting through the diner. His attention remained on Ava as she happily arranged strawberries into the shape of a smiling face. She giggled proudly before sliding the plate toward him. "This one is you," she said. Marcus laughed quietly. "Then I guess I should smile just as much." For a little while, the world felt wonderfully ordinary. No lawyers, no cameras, no headlines. Just a father and his daughter sharing breakfast the way they always had. Several miles away, Claire stepped into the gleaming headquarters of Whitmore Dynamics, greeted by applause from assistants and senior executives who had followed the divorce through whispered office conversations. A bottle of sparkling cider had already been opened inside the executive conference room. "Congratulations," one board member said with a confident smile. "Now there will finally be fewer distractions." Another executive laughed softly. "You built this company on your own anyway." Claire accepted the compliments without correcting anyone. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that was not entirely true. Marcus had spent years encouraging her before investors believed in her vision. He had stayed awake through countless nights reviewing presentations, correcting financial models, and quietly reminding her that confidence mattered just as much as preparation. Yet those memories had become strangely distant beneath years of success. Success had a way of rewriting history when people allowed pride to hold the pen. Later that afternoon, Claire entered her spacious corner office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected rows of steel towers stretching toward the clouds while yellow taxis moved like tiny pieces across the streets below. Her assistant handed her the finalized divorce documents. "Everything has been completed," she said. Claire glanced through the pages one last time. Marcus had accepted almost every condition without negotiation. He had not fought over the penthouse. He had not demanded additional investments. He had not argued over expensive artwork, vacation properties, or luxury vehicles. The only request he had made was simple. Every other weekend with Ava and uninterrupted time on her birthday, Christmas morning, and the first week of every summer vacation. Claire remembered her attorney leaning across the conference table only days earlier. "This is unusual," he had admitted. "Most divorces involving this level of wealth become long battles." Marcus had simply answered, "Children should never become prizes that adults compete to win." Even Claire had remained silent after hearing those words. At the time she assumed he was surrendering because he knew he could not compete with her financial resources. Now, sitting alone in the quiet office, she found herself unexpectedly unsettled. Why had he walked away so peacefully? Why had there been no anger? No bargaining? No attempt to preserve appearances? She looked again at the final signature. Marcus Reed. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, and almost graceful. It did not resemble the signature of a defeated man. It looked like the signature of someone closing a chapter he had already finished reading long before everyone else. Outside the office, employees continued celebrating another successful quarter while congratulating their brilliant chief executive officer. Inside, Claire stood silently beside the window, watching helicopters drift across the afternoon sky without realizing that somewhere beyond the city, another aircraft was quietly preparing for departure, carrying a truth that would soon force every assumption she had made about Marcus to come undone. The following morning began long before sunrise. Marcus quietly loaded Ava's small pink suitcase into the trunk of his aging sedan before driving through streets still washed in pale blue dawn. The city had not fully awakened. Storefront lights flickered one by one, delivery trucks rumbled through empty intersections, and the skyline slowly emerged from the morning mist. Ava rested peacefully in the passenger seat, hugging the stuffed rabbit she had carried since preschool. Marcus glanced at her with the gentle smile of a father who measured success differently than the world around him. As they approached a quiet regional airport on the outskirts of the city, Ava rubbed her eyes and looked through the windshield. "Dad," she whispered, "this is not the airport where everybody goes." Marcus chuckled softly. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes there are quieter places where people can travel without crowds." She accepted the answer without another question. She had learned years ago that her father never lied to her, even when he chose not to explain everything. The security gate opened almost immediately after the attendant recognized Marcus's vehicle. No identification was requested. No paperwork changed hands. The guard simply smiled warmly and tipped his cap. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. Welcome back." Marcus nodded politely. "Thank you, Daniel. I hope your granddaughter enjoyed her birthday." The older man blinked in surprise before smiling even wider. "She loved the telescope you sent. She has not stopped looking at the stars." Marcus simply replied, "Tell her to keep dreaming." Ava looked at her father curiously. "You know everybody." Marcus laughed quietly. "No, I just try to remember people." They continued driving toward a private terminal surrounded by neatly trimmed grass and rows of immaculate aircraft glistening beneath the rising sun. The polished windows reflected streaks of orange and gold across the tarmac, while the cool morning breeze carried the distant sound of turbine engines warming for departure. A sleek Gulfstream G700 stood waiting near the far end of the apron, its silver fuselage glowing beneath the first light of day. Two pilots stood beside the aircraft in crisp Navy uniforms. A flight attendant waited near the stairs with an easy, welcoming smile. None of them appeared rushed. None of them looked surprised to see Marcus arrive. Instead, the captain walked forward with quiet professionalism. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. Everything is ready whenever you and Miss Ava are comfortable." Ava stopped walking. Her eyes grew wide. She looked from the enormous airplane to her father and back again. "Dad," she whispered, almost afraid to ask, "are we allowed to get on that one?" Marcus knelt beside her and gently brushed a curl away from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, we are." Before Ava could answer, the distant roar of another engine echoed across the runway. At nearly that same moment, less than 5 miles away, Claire's chauffeur steered her limousine toward a nearby aviation conference where she had been invited to deliver the keynote address on innovation and global leadership. As the limousine slowed near an intersection overlooking the private airport, Claire absent-mindedly glanced through the tinted window. She expected to see business, executives boarding charter flights. Instead, her attention froze on a familiar figure standing calmly beside one of the most advanced private jets in the world, while an entire flight crew welcomed him with the unmistakable respect reserved not for a passenger, but for the man they had been waiting for. Claire leaned forward, her fingers slowly lowering the tablet she had been reviewing as the limousine rolled to a stop at the traffic light overlooking the private terminal. "Wait," she said quietly. Her chauffeur glanced into the rearview mirror. "Is everything all right, Miss Whitmore?" She did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the familiar silhouette standing beside the Gulfstream. Even from a distance, she recognized Marcus's calm posture and the way Ava happily bounced beside him while clutching her stuffed rabbit. "That cannot be him," Claire whispered to herself. The chauffeur followed her gaze toward the runway. "Do you know the gentleman?" Claire forced a brief smile. "I thought I did." The light remained red. Time seemed to slow as the captain approached Marcus holding a leather flight portfolio. Instead of requesting identification or confirming the passenger manifest, the pilot extended his hand with genuine respect. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. Weather conditions are excellent. We should arrive in Jackson Hole exactly on schedule." Marcus shook his hand warmly. "Thank you, Captain Ellis. Has your wife recovered well from her surgery?" The captain's expression softened immediately. "She has. We will never forget what you did for our family." Marcus nodded gently. "I am just grateful she is healthy." Claire frowned. None of this made sense. Flight crews did not greet ordinary charter clients that way. They certainly did not speak to them with the familiarity usually reserved for longtime friends or company owners. Her confusion deepened as the flight attendant knelt beside Ava. "Miss Ava, we made your favorite blueberry muffins this morning."
Chef insisted.
Ava's face lit up with delight. "Really?" The attendant smiled. "He has been practicing the recipe all week." Claire felt an uncomfortable weight settle in her chest. She had spent years believing Marcus lived an uncomplicated, modest life centered entirely around raising Ava. She had never questioned how he always managed to be available whenever their daughter needed him. She had simply assumed he lacked greater ambition. Now every assumption began quietly unraveling. The limousine slowly continued forward as traffic cleared, but Claire turned in her seat for one last look through the rear window. At that exact moment, a polished black sport utility vehicle approached the aircraft carrying two sharply dressed executives. They stepped out carrying presentation cases but immediately paused upon seeing Marcus. Without hesitation, both men walked directly toward him. One appeared to be in his 60s with silver hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to leading billion-dollar negotiations. Yet he waited patiently until Marcus finished helping Ava climb the aircraft stairs before extending his hand. Marcus greeted him with the same quiet humility he showed the waitress at the diner and the security guard at the gate.
No arrogance.
No performance. Just simple respect. The older executive laughed warmly before handing Marcus several folders for review. Claire caught only a brief glimpse of the documents before distance concealed the details, but one bold corporate logo was impossible to mistake. It belonged to Ashcroft Global Capital, one of the largest private investment firms in the country, a company whose partnership Whitmore Dynamics had unsuccessfully pursued for nearly 3 years. Her heartbeat quickened. The limousine turned the corner, hiding the runway from view just as the Gulfstream's engines rose into a smooth, powerful hum. Claire stared silently through the glass while a single question echoed louder than the departing aircraft. If Marcus Reed had truly been the ordinary man she believed she had left behind, why did some of the most influential people in American business seem to be waiting for his approval instead of the other way around? High above the clouds, the cabin was remarkably quiet. Soft sunlight filtered through oversized windows, painting warm reflections across polished walnut panels while Ava sat, curled into a cream leather seat, happily looking through a picture book the flight attendant had placed beside her. Marcus watched her for a moment before turning his attention toward the conference table where several documents remained neatly arranged. Across from him sat Richard Ashcroft, founder and chairman of Ashcroft Global Capital. Few people outside the financial world knew that Richard had spent more than 15 years asking Marcus to become the public face of the investment firm. Few knew that Marcus had declined every offer. Richard smiled as he closed another folder. "You still refuse to put your name on the building." Marcus returned the smile. "Buildings do not make good fathers." Richard laughed quietly. "You have not changed." Marcus looked through the window where endless white clouds stretched toward the horizon. "I promised myself that if success ever forced me to choose between another board meeting and reading Ava a bedtime story, I would always choose the bedtime story." Richard nodded with genuine admiration. "Most people spend their lives chasing wealth because they think it will buy freedom. You earned freedom first, then used it wisely." Marcus never answered. Silence had always been more comfortable than praise. Years earlier, long before Claire launched Whitmore Dynamics, Marcus had quietly developed a cloud security platform while consulting for several government technology projects. Rather than building a company around himself, he licensed the technology to multiple firms, accepted equity instead of large salaries, and patiently watched those investments grow over the next decade. Later, he identified promising businesses that others overlooked, investing carefully without attaching his name to press releases or interviews. Financial magazines occasionally referred to an anonymous investor whose companies seemed unusually successful, but Marcus had never granted an interview or attended award ceremonies. Privacy had become the one luxury he valued above every other. After Ava was born, that decision became even easier. He purchased aircraft not to impress strangers but to shorten travel time so he could finish international meetings and still return home before bedtime whenever possible. He bought homes that remained mostly empty because the place he truly treasured was the modest house where Ava had learned to ride her bicycle. Richard slid one final document across the table. Whitmore Dynamics submitted another partnership proposal last month. Their board seems very determined. Marcus glanced briefly at the familiar company logo before gently closing the folder without reading further. "Please continue evaluating the proposal fairly," he said. "Their employees deserve every opportunity to succeed." Richard studied him carefully. Even now, Marcus folded his hands calmly. Business should never become revenge. Thousands of families depend on that company. They should never suffer because two people could not save a marriage. Richard lowered his eyes with quiet respect. In all his years working alongside billionaires, founders, and world leaders, he had rarely encountered someone with so much influence and so little desire to display it. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away inside the executive offices of Whitmore Dynamics, Claire stared at the Ashcroft Global Capital logo glowing across her computer screen after receiving another notice that their partnership review had once again been delayed. She sighed with frustration, unaware that the man she had dismissed as ordinary had just instructed one of the most powerful investment firms in America to judge her company with complete fairness, even after she had stopped believing he deserved the same kindness. 3 days later, the executive boardroom at Whitmore Dynamics felt unusually tense. The polished oak table reflected rows of open laptops, untouched coffee cups, and anxious expressions as department heads waited for Claire to begin the weekly strategy meeting. Usually she entered with absolute confidence. Today she carried something different, doubt. She placed a thick folder on the table without saying a word. Ashcroft Global Capital has delayed their decision again, the chief financial officer reported carefully. If we do not secure this partnership before the end of the quarter, expansion into the European market may be postponed. Claire nodded slowly. Did they give a reason? No, but one of our contacts mentioned that the final recommendation comes from a very small executive committee. Silence settled across the room. One senior vice president finally cleared his throat. There is another detail. Claire looked up. Go ahead. Our contact said every major investment recommendation eventually reaches one private advisor before approval. He hesitated. Apparently, if that advisor believes a company lacks long-term integrity, the committee listens. Claire frowned. Who is this advisor? The executive shook his head. No one seems to know. They rarely appear in public and never give interviews. The meeting continued, but Claire found herself distracted. Her thoughts repeatedly returned to the private airport. Marcus standing beside the Gulf Stream. The respect in the captain's voice. The senior executive waiting patiently for him to finish helping Ava before discussing business. None of it fit the man she believed she had known for more than a decade. Later that afternoon, curiosity overcame pride. Claire asked her executive assistant to retrieve archived corporate correspondence from Whitmore Dynamics' earliest years. Several dusty storage boxes arrived within the hour. She spent nearly 2 hours sorting through handwritten notes, investor letters, and old presentation binders from the company's first fundraising campaign. Near the bottom of one box, she discovered a slim blue notebook with her own handwriting across the cover. Product strategy ideas. She smiled faintly before opening it. Inside were technical diagrams, market forecasts, and countless brainstorming pages from years earlier. Then she noticed something unexpected. Entire sections had been rewritten in another handwriting. Marcus's handwriting. Clear, careful, precise. Every corrected financial assumption. Every improved security architecture diagram. Every revised investor presentation outline. Every note simply signed with a small letter M in the corner. She turned another page. Then another. Nearly half the notebook carried Marcus's quiet fingerprints. Not literally, but intellectually. He had never crossed out her ideas. He had strengthened them. Never claimed credit. Never added his own name. Only small comments written in the margins. Your idea is stronger if simplified. Investors trust clarity. Do not underestimate yourself. Claire closed the notebook and leaned back slowly. Her office suddenly felt much quieter than usual. The city outside continued moving with its familiar urgency. But inside those four walls, time seemed suspended. She realized something painfully simple. Marcus had spent years helping her become successful without ever asking the world to know he had done so. He had stood behind the spotlight while encouraging her to stand inside it. The applause she had accepted so confidently had never belonged to her alone. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, Claire did not feel victorious. She felt profoundly humbled, because she was beginning to understand that the greatest gift Marcus had ever given her was not his money, his knowledge, or his influence. It was the quiet belief that she could become extraordinary, even if history forgot that he had been there every step of the way. The following Saturday arrived with clear skies and the gentle warmth of early autumn. Central Park was filled with families pushing strollers, children chasing bubbles across the grass, and musicians filling the air with familiar melodies. Marcus sat quietly on a wooden bench while Ava carefully fed small pieces of bread to a group of ducks gathered near the pond. He smiled every time she laughed, as though those simple moments carried more value than any business meeting ever could. His phone vibrated once. The screen displayed a familiar name, Claire Whitmore. Marcus looked at it for several seconds before answering. "Hello, Claire." Her voice was softer than he remembered. "Could we meet? Just for a few minutes. It is important." Marcus glanced toward Ava. "We are at Central Park near Bow Bridge. I will be there in 20 minutes, she replied. When Claire arrived, she wore neither an expensive designer jacket nor the polished confidence that usually surrounded her. Instead, she carried only the worn blue notebook she had discovered. Inside the company archives, she approached slowly, almost uncertain whether she deserved to interrupt the peaceful afternoon. Marcus stood politely. "Hello, Claire." She looked at him for several long seconds before speaking. "I found this." She gently held out the notebook. Marcus recognized it immediately. "I forgot that still existed." Claire opened several pages filled with his handwritten notes. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Because they were your ideas." "No," Claire whispered, her voice beginning to tremble. "They became successful because you made them stronger." Marcus shook his head gently. "Claire, success belongs to the person willing to work for it every single day. You did that." She lowered her eyes. "I spent years believing I built everything alone." A quiet breeze carried golden leaves across the walking path between them. Children laughed nearby while a sailboat drifted peacefully across the lake. The world continued moving with comforting normality, giving two people the rare chance to speak honestly without cameras or applause. Claire finally looked back at him. "I also learned about Ashcroft Global Capital." Marcus remained silent. "You could have stopped every opportunity my company had after the divorce." "Yes," Marcus answered calmly. "But that would have punished thousands of employees who never hurt either of us." Claire closed her eyes briefly. "I laughed at you in the courthouse." Marcus did not deny it. "I assumed you had no ambition because you chose a different life than mine." He looked toward Ava, who was now carefully helping a younger child gather spilled birdseed from the path. "I did choose a different life," he said softly. "I chose to be present while our daughter grew up." Claire followed his gaze. For the first time, she truly saw what Marcus had been protecting all along. Not his reputation, not his fortune, his time with the little girl who trusted him completely. Tears quietly filled her eyes. "I am sorry, Marcus. Truly sorry." Marcus looked back at her with the same calm expression he had carried inside the courthouse. There was no anger,
No satisfaction.
Only quiet honesty. I forgive you, Claire. Hope briefly flickered across her face before he gently continued. But forgiveness and going backward are not always the same journey. Claire slowly nodded. She understood. Some bridges could be rebuilt. Others existed only to remind people how precious trust had once been. And in that peaceful afternoon beneath the changing leaves, she realized the greatest distance between them had never been measured by wealth or success. It had been measured by the respect she had forgotten to give the man who never stopped giving it to everyone else. Several months passed, and winter quietly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring. Life settled into a new rhythm that no longer revolved around courtrooms, public opinions, or the echoes of painful words. Every other Friday afternoon, Marcus picked Ava up from school, and every time she spotted his familiar sedan waiting outside, she ran into his arms with the same joyful smile that had never changed. Those moments remained the greatest success he had ever known. Whitmore Dynamics eventually received its long-awaited partnership with Ashcroft Global Capital after an independent review confirmed the company's strength and long-term potential. The announcement made headlines across the business world, but no article mentioned the quiet recommendation that had encouraged the committee to judge the company only on its merits. Marcus insisted it remain that way. Recognition had never been his destination. Claire slowly transformed as well. Employees noticed that she began learning every assistant's name, thanking custodians before leaving the office each evening, and spending more time listening than speaking during executive meetings. The company culture changed almost as quietly as she had. One afternoon, a young manager nervously apologized for making an expensive mistake during a presentation. Instead of embarrassment or criticism, Claire simply smiled and said, "Everyone deserves the chance to grow. Someone once believed in me before I deserved it." She never explained where she had learned that lesson. On a bright Saturday morning, Ava stood beside Marcus on the observation deck of the same private airport, where everything had quietly begun to change. A Gulf Stream rested nearby beneath a cloudless blue sky, its polished wings reflecting the morning sun. Ava looked up at her father with thoughtful eyes. "Dad, are rich people happier?" Marcus smiled gently before kneeling beside her. "Money can make life more comfortable, sweetheart, but kindness is what makes life meaningful. Never confuse the two." She nodded carefully, storing the words somewhere only a child's heart can keep them. As the captain welcomed them aboard once again, Marcus paused for a final glance across the peaceful runway. There was no audience.
No applause.
No one waiting to admire what he owned. Only quiet skies, a grateful heart, and the simple joy of walking beside his daughter. Sometimes the greatest victories are never announced. They arrive quietly, wrapped in forgiveness instead of revenge, humility instead of pride, and dignity instead of applause. The people who laughed may eventually discover the truth, but by then, the person they underestimated has already found something far more valuable than proving them wrong. They have found peace. And in the end, peace is the only success that never needs to introduce itself.